Hello, my name is Mrs. George Shult. Mary to my friends. I was born June 15th, 1881 in Nova Scotia, Canada, the first child of Philip MacDonald and Margaret Mackenzie MacDonald. Yes, all my grandparents were Scottish, but my parents had been born in Nova Scotia. 2 sisters and then 2 brothers came after me. Father was a carpenter in the Victoria district. He had some distant cousins, others the clan MacDonald, who had settled in southwest Washington state in America, and he dreamed of doing the same. So Father went to purchase a tract of land to settle on, and we immigrated to America a few years later in 1892 when I was 11. We took the train out west. The homestead was on the north side of a beautiful lake called Toutle Lake, about halfway between the post offices of Silver Lake and Sightly. It was 80 acres and very fertile, being so close to the lake and having been cleared off by the previous owner. I finished school in the 8th grade and then spent my time helping around the farm. It was at a social dance at the schoolhouse that I met my future husband. George Shult was a timber faller from Wisconsin who'd been working for Mr. Barnes of the Barnes & Bull lumber mill near the schoolhouse. Even though George was 15 years older than me, he was sweet, and he had a great mustache. We got married at my parents' house on October 16th, 1901. We rented a house in Castle Rock, and George went to work for one of the mills there. 11 months later, our first child, Mildred, was born. Barely more than a year after that, our second daughter, Eunice, came along, named after a sister of George's. Much of the time I was alone with the girls, while George was out in the woods cutting bolts for the shingle mills. In early April 1905, I got word that my younger brother Roy had been killed in a logging accident. He was only 17. In 1906, George went back to working for Mr. Barnes, whose company was now called the Silver Lake Railroad and Timber Company. We've moved back up to the lake, this time just to the east, in the Sightly area. I'm glad we moved back up there with all the things that happened that winter. There was a terrible storm in November after a cold spell when the mountain had lots of snow. In just 2 days, the Cowlitz River rose 14 feet. I saw the devastation to Castle Rock afterwards and wept for the town's loss. In late December, when everyone in town was still recovering and trying to piece together a Merry Christmas, Father started to get sick. It seemed like trouble with his heart. He died a week later on January 2nd, 1907. We buried him next to Roy at the Silver Lake Cemetery. Within a year and a half, both my sisters had run off and got married, leaving Mother with only my youngest brother, Daniel, to help on their farm. Life went on. In November 1910, I gave birth to our first son, Calvin. A year and a half later, I had Jason, our second boy. The older girls were good with them and were a great help to me. Mother died in 1915, leaving the farm to 20-year-old Daniel. 2 years later, my last child came along, a daughter, and I named her Margaret after Mother. By then, we'd moved to a place on the west side of the Cowlitz, above Castle Rock, while George worked out in the woods. The children could walk to school over the new steel bridge, and it was also a short ride to the Methodist Church on Sundays. When the United States joined the Great War, George was thankfully too old for the draft. That and his job as a woodsman kept him out of military service, as they were considered essential to the war effort. It was terrible to hear that some of our local boys died in service. The first one we heard about was Harlan Merrill, who was killed by some new form of influenza up at Fort Worden. It was after the armistice in November that we got reports of death in combat or from wounds received. George Eaton and Albert Rosen from up the Toutle, and Dick Sugars, Elmer Leonard, and Scott Chisholm from in town. In December, the same influenza that killed poor young Mr. Merrill began to spread around town, despite there being a mask order on and a limit to public gatherings. It struck our family about 2 weeks into the new year. I was stuck in bed, and so was Eunice. Through my ragged breath, I implored George to keep the children safe. I died on January 17th, 1919, at the age of 37. They laid me to rest in the Whittle Cemetery. George tried with the children, he really did, but most of them would join me all too soon. Eunice died just a month after me at the hospital in Chehalis. Poor little Margaret, who I'd barely gotten to know before I passed, died herself in 1929 when she was only 12. Jason followed a year later from a car accident. He was only 18. 2 years after Calvin died, George finally joined me in 1945. He had never remarried.